welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty fascinating. The link, or sometimes the gap, between scientific research and actual policymaking.
Yeah, it's a critical connection. And we're using the Horizon Europe project pattern as a sort of case study, looking specifically at agricultural environmental policies.
Exactly. And our source material today is, well, it's quite special, isn't it?
It really is. It's from someone who's been right there in the thick of it, presenting pattern research findings and also working inside the Flemish government right after their PhD.
So you, the listener, are getting a perspective from the trenches, so to speak.
Yeah.
A first-hand look at why this science policy thing can be, well, our source calls it turbulent.
Turbulent, yeah, that's a strong word. And it suggests it's not just a smooth handover of information.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack why it's turbulent. We want to pull out the key challenges, the nuances, the sticky points when you try to make research useful for policymakers in the real world.
We'll see why it's not always a straightforward collaboration and, what factors really come into play behind the scenes.
Okay, so where do we start? Interestingly, the source kicks off with a positive moment.
Yeah, a bit of a success story first. At this ERA conference, a policymaker actually stood up and praised a pattern study.
Praised it for what exactly?
For really good collaboration between the scientists and the policymakers involved. They liked the practical policy recommendations that came out of it.
Okay, practical recommendations, good collaboration.
And also, apparently, it really helped the policymakers get a better handle on a specific research method, something called a Discrete Choice Experiment, or DCE.
Which sounds like a win-win, right? Science gets done, policy gets informed.
You'd think so. But then, almost in the next breath, the author says getting to that point was not easy.
Ah, okay. There's the catch.
Exactly. It flags that even the successes might have had a pretty bumpy ride getting there, that turbulent word again.
And this seems tied to the author's own experience working within government.
Very much so. They spent 2 years with the Flemish government and saw firsthand how often miscommunication, just basic misunderstanding happens between scientists and civil servants.
Like they're speaking different languages sometimes.
Sort of, yeah. Different cultures, different priorities, different ways of looking at problems. It really highlights that disconnect.
And there was that pretty blunt quote someone mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Apparently at some symposium, someone actually said, and maybe it's a bit over the top, but they said, scientists don't know anything about policy.
Wow. Okay, that's direct.
It is, but it sets the stage perfectly for exploring why someone might feel that way. What are these different perspectives?
So let's dig into that. One of the first big reasons seems to be just the sheer complexity of policy itself.
Absolutely. The source uses agri-environment climate measures, AECMs, and eco-schemes from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy as an example.
Right, the CAP. Sounds like one big policy from Brussels, maybe.
Well, yes and no. It starts at the European level, but then it has to be, translated and actually implemented by each member state.
And it gets trickier because in a place like Belgium, agriculture isn't even handled nationally, is it?
Exactly right. It's regional. So for this specific case, we're talking about Flanders. The Flemish government is the one making the calls.
Okay. EU level, member state level, now regional level. Layers upon layers.
And wait, there's more. Within Flanders, these AECMs aren't just one thing. They're split into 2 different types of instruments.
2. Okay, what are they?
So first you have agri-environmental, let's call them AMKMs. They're run by the Agency for Agriculture and Fisheries. Think of them as focusing on the environmental and climate side effects of actual farming production, sort of the work and economy angle.
Got it. AMKMs, farming impact. What's the other one?
The other one is Beheerverkomsten, or BOs. These are managed by a completely different body, the Flemish Land Agency.
And they're focused.
Their focus is much more on biodiversity, landscape management, habitat protection, more the environment policy domain.
Okay, so even within one region, you have 2 different schemes run by 2 different agencies with slightly different names.
Precisely. And the names themselves can cause confusion. AMKM basically translates directly to Agri-Environment Climate Measure, but BO, Beheerverkomsten, that translates literally to management agreements.
Which doesn't immediately scream environment or biodiversity, does it?
Not really, especially if you're explaining it internationally in English. The author notes they often just use the umbrella term voluntary agri-environmental measures, but even that smooths over important differences.
And this complexity isn't unique to Flanders, right? The way these things are implemented varies hugely across Europe.
Massively. Our source really stresses this. What counts as an AECM, how it's designed, how farmers are told about it, how it's monitored, the payment levels. It can be completely different between member states.
Even between, say, Flanders and Wallonie next door.
Oh, definitely. Or compare Flanders to somewhere like the Czech Republic. The source gives payment examples in Flanders, maybe 432 to 2,644 per hectare for certain things. In the Czech Republic, the range mentioned is more like 15 to 1,136 per hectare. Huge difference.
That really drives home how dangerous it is to make general assumptions about these policies.
Absolutely. And the variation happens within Flanders, too. For those BOs, the management agreements, there are different types targeting different things.
Like what?
Like schemes specifically for farmland birds or meadow birds or protecting certain landscape features. Each one has its own design, its own objectives.
And presumably different payment rates again.
You bet. That's where you see that range from €432 up to 2,644 per hectare. Or sometimes it's paid per tree planted or per meter of hedgerow established.
Wow. And some are only in certain areas or have optional extras.
Exactly. It's incredibly tailored, which is maybe good for local results, but it adds layer upon layer of complexity for researchers trying to study it and for policymakers managing it.
So because it was so complex, the pattern study had to narrow things down.
They did. They ended up focusing specifically on the botanical management of grasslands under these schemes. But even then, there were different ecological phases of grassland to consider. It just kept getting more complicated.
Which brings us nicely to this idea of local context being absolutely critical and how misunderstandings can happen when it's missing.
Yes. The author shares a really telling anecdote about trying to get their research published.
What happened?
Well, they'd done a discrete choice experiment, figuring out farmers' willingness to accept payment, WTA, for a hypothetical BO scheme.
Okay. And the result?
The model suggested a WTA of around 1,222 per hectare, potentially up to 1673 with some extra practices included.
And the problem was?
A reviewer for the scientific journal basically said those numbers were excessively high and questioned if the results were even credible.
Uh-oh. But were they high?
Well, here's the kicker. That amount, around 1,200 to 1,700 per hectare, it was completely within the range of payments actually being offered for similar BO schemes in Flanders at that time.
So the reviewer just didn't know the local situation.
Exactly. They were likely judging it based on maybe a national average or what they were familiar with without realizing the specific Flemish context where those payment levels were perfectly normal.
It's a perfect example of how easily assumptions can be wrong if you don't understand the local details. Generalizing is risky.
Totally. And it highlights how much compensation can vary, making it hard to compare results across different regions or countries easily.
This also connects to another point the source makes. Sometimes the research project's goals and the policy's goals aren't perfectly aligned.
Yes, that's a really important one. In the Pattern project, a lot of the focus was on evaluating the climate impact of these measures.
Okay, carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emissions, that sort of thing.
Right. But remember, those BOs, the management agreements run by the Flemish Land Agency, their primary objective wasn't climate mitigation.
What was it again? Biodiversity?
Primarily, yes. Providing habitat for specific species, improving the ecological quality of the landscape. That's what the agency was focused on.
And does the scale of things matter here?
It does. Flanders is tiny, right? Like a 0.3% of the EU's land area, 0.4% of its agricultural area.
Okay, very small.
And participation in these BOs, while important locally, isn't massive overall. Maybe 12% of Flemish farmers participate, covering only about 0.4% of the total Flemish agricultural land.
So if you're looking at the big picture of climate change,
the direct climate impact of those BOs in Flanders is likely pretty marginal. It's just not a huge land area changing use in the grand scheme of things.
the Flemish Land Agency was more interested in whether the schemes were actually helping the birds or plants they were designed for.
Exactly. Are the population trends of the target species improving? That was their key question, much more than the carbon impact.
Which must have created some challenges for the Pattern project if their models were focused more on climate.
It did. The author mentions it was difficult to properly integrate those specific biodiversity conservation goals into their models.
Why was that? Data issues.
Partly data limitations, yeah, but also just a lack of full understanding of the really complex ways biodiversity responds to these kinds of interventions. It's not always a simple cause and effect.
This raises a broader point, doesn't it? We often talk about environmental impact as if it's one single thing.
Yes, and often it gets boiled down to just climate or just biodiversity. People forget about other crucial aspects: soil health, water quality, air pollution, the abiotic factors.
And policies themselves often focus on one objective, sometimes at the expense of others.
Definitely. There are almost always trade-offs. The source uses the example of using agricultural land for solar panels or wind turbines.
Right. Good for renewable energy targets, maybe good for climate goals.
But it takes land away from food production, and it certainly impacts the local landscape and biodiversity. There's no easy answer. It's a balancing act.
Like in that German novel, the source mentions Unterlüten, where the village fights over wind turbines.
Exactly. These conflicts between different, often equally valid environmental or social goals are very real.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about policy complexity and differing goals. What about the practicalities of actually doing the research, the evaluation methods?
Right. The source talks quite a bit about those discrete choice experiments, the DCEs.
Remind us what they are again? Surveys.
Yeah, basically surveys, often done online these days. You present farmers with different hypothetical policy packages, maybe different payment levels, contract lengths, required actions, and ask them which they'd prefer.
And the goal is to figure out what features they value most.
Exactly. But to get results that are statistically solid and actually useful for policymakers, you need a good number of farmers to respond and respond accurately.
And therein lies the rub, I imagine, getting farmers to participate.
It's a huge challenge. Farmers, as the source points out, often work incredibly long hours, face tight margins, and are already drowning in administrative paperwork.
So taking an hour out to fill in a complex survey for some research project.
They might not be high on their priority list, especially if they don't see a direct, immediate benefit for themselves.
And this leads to the survey fatigue issue.
Absolutely. There's just so much research going on, often targeting the same population. The source gives a really stark example from Flanders.
What was that?
In just a few months, there were apparently 6 different DCE surveys planned, all targeting Flemish farmers about sustainable practices, each one aiming for maybe 300 responses.
Wow, 6 surveys. How many farmers would they need to contact to get 300 responses each?
Probably thousands. The example suggests maybe contacting 3,000 farmers just to get 300 responses for one survey. Now multiply that. You can see how farmers would just get totally overwhelmed and stop responding.
Yeah, completely understandable. That really undermines the research effort if you can't get the data.
It does. Yeah. And designing these DCEs isn't simple either. It's often a collaborative process.
Involving who?
Scientists, obviously, but also civil servants from the relevant agencies, maybe people from agricultural advisory services, even representatives from farmers' associations.
Which sounds good, getting buy-in, but probably takes ages.
It can lead to very lengthy discussions, yes. Trying to agree on which policy features to include, what levels to test, how to phrase the questions clearly.
The source mentioned an example with farmers groups having reservations.
Yeah, about asking farmers hypothetical willingness to pay questions for things like advisory services, which are often currently free or subsidized.
Why the reservation? Worried it would lead to charging them.
That seems to be the concern. So clear communication was vital, explaining that these values were more for understanding priorities, not setting actual prices.
And the author's background helped there?
Apparently so. Being a Dutch-speaking former civil servant probably helped build trust and explain the purpose in a way that resonated.
And it's not just the design. Even the timing of launching a survey can be tricky.
Definitely. The source notes one survey launch had to be postponed because the political situation was unstable at the time.
Why postpone?
The worry was that launching it during political turmoil could create false expectations among farmers, or just make them too cynical to respond properly, leading to low response rates or biased answers. Real-world politics interfering with research plans.
So, okay, getting the data is hard, but even once you have it, the source points out limitations in what these methods can actually tell policymakers.
Right. DCEs, by design, can only really focus on a limited number of policy characteristics at a time. You can't test everything.
So the scope of new information you get is kind of narrow.
It can be, and it makes it harder to generalize the findings or apply them to completely different policy designs.
Researchers try to work around this how?
Well, like in Pattern, you might include multiple experiments within one survey or run several different surveys covering different aspects.
But that just bumps up against the survey length and fatigue issues again.
Exactly. It's a trade-off. Which, again, underlines why those initial discussions between scientists and policymakers are so crucial to carefully select the most important features and levels to investigate.
It's about focusing the research effort where it's most needed.
Right. And it wasn't just DCEs. The source mentions other methods in pattern also had their limits. Models often have to make simplifying assumptions.
Like what?
Like using a randomized decision algorithm in a larger model predicting policy uptake, even though the DCEs themselves show that farmers' actual decisions are way more complex than random.
You just can't capture all the real-world nuance in a model sometimes.
Pretty much, which leads to this concept the author brings up, the value of information, or VOI, from a study, meaning you need to weigh the potential usefulness of the findings against the cost and effort, time, money, respondent burden involved in getting that information. Is it worth it?
And that value, that VOI, increases when the research leads to really actionable recommendations.
Precisely. The recommendations need to be clear, concrete, and something policymakers can actually do. And for that, researchers need some insight into how government procedures actually work.
Which they don't always have, leading to recommendations that aren't very helpful.
Sometimes, yeah. The source gives a couple of classic examples, like researchers recommending higher economic incentives for these environmental schemes.
Sounds reasonable. Farmers like money.
It does, but it often ignores the fact that in many systems, like the EU's CIP, payments have to be legally justified based on specific calculations, income forgone, costs incurred, transaction costs. You can't just arbitrarily increase them because a study says so.
Ah, okay. There are rules.
There are rules. Similarly, recommending that a policy needs more flexibility.
Also sounds good in principle.
But it's too vague. Flexible in what way? Which rules? And what are the implications for monitoring compliance, for administration, for potential fraud? You need to be specific.
So just saying be more flexible doesn't actually help the policymaker figure out how to change the policy.
Not really. It shows a lack of understanding of the practical constraints they operate under.
So wrapping this all up, the conclusion seems to be that bridging this gap between the world of research and the world of government is... oh, it's just plain difficult.
It really is, and it's not about blaming one side or the other.
No, the author seems to suggest both sides need to do some thinking.
Yeah, reflecting on how they understand this science policy interface, how they collaborate in projects like Pattern, there's room for improvement on both ends.
And maybe more mixing between the two worlds could help.
That's one suggestion. More policymakers who have a background in science, and maybe more scientists spending time working within governmental institutions to understand the realities.
Okay, so for everyone listening, the main takeaway seems to be that this journey from a scientific finding to a policy that actually works on the ground, it's complicated.
Really complicated. You've got all these layers of governance, you've got terminology differences, you've got research goals not quite matching policy goals.
You've got the practical headaches of doing the research, like surveying busy farmers, and then the limitations of the methods themselves.
And finally, the need for recommendations that aren't just evidence-based, but are also locally relevant and, actually actionable within the constraints policymakers face.
So that positive feedback at the start, while great,
it underscores that achieving that kind of successful connection takes serious effort, mutual understanding, and probably navigating some of that turbulence along the way.
Right. So finally, a provocative thought to leave everyone with. Given all these challenges, these different languages and priorities, these potential misunderstandings, what else could we do?
Yeah, what innovative approaches could actually make this science policy link stronger? How do we make sure valuable research really does inform the decisions shaping our environment, our agriculture, our world?
And what's the responsibility of scientists in making their work usable? And what's the responsibility of policymakers in engaging with the science? Lots to chew on there.
Definitely. It's a crucial conversation.
Thanks for diving deep with us on this one.